People that are well qualified to discuss that. I'll introduce them in turn as they give their prepared remarks, and then we'll do the Q&A. And we've got till maximum 5:30, so we've got hopefully plenty of time. So we're going to start with Svetlana Savranskaya. She's a research fellow at the GWU, George Washington University, at the National Security Archive, and I would like to pay tribute to the work of the National Security Archive. It's certainly been a great help to me over the years, and to many other scholars as well. She directs its cooperative projects with Russian archives and institutes and edits the Russian and East Bloc archival documents database. Svetlana has a PhD in political science and international affairs from Emory University. She's worked at the Carter Presidential Center in Atlanta as a Hewlett Fellow. While doing her PhD, she served as a research associate and an interpreter for several NSA CWIHP joint efforts. I presume that's National Security Archive CWIHP joint efforts, unless the project has been getting into bed with the guys in Fort Meade, including most prominently the Carter-Brezhnev project of Brown University's Whetten Institute, as well as the end of the Cold War project. Svetlana is a Russian citizen. She's won several fellowships and awards during her graduate studies, including a prestigious dissertation fellowship from the Institute for the Study of World Politics. So here's Svetlana.
I'm not gonna. Okay. Thank you very much. And sitting here during the first panel, I realized how different my presentation is going to be. I am here in the sphere of very technological intelligence expertise, and I am going to talk about politics and personalities. And I would like to kind of step back and put us in the Soviet context to try to explain why does Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership react to the U-2 the way they did, why it leads to the collapse of the Geneva conference, and also I would like to talk a little bit about the consequences and any lessons, if there were any, that were learned from the U-2 shootdown. The main argument, to summarize it, is just looking at the available evidence. I think I conclude that the shootdown takes place at a very unfortunate moment. It really is, on many scales, a very unfortunate moment to Khrushchev, both domestically and internationally. Khrushchev in the late 1950s and early 1960s, but especially in late 1950s, is truly genuinely trying to end the Cold War and open up for a détente with the United States and with the West in general. Also, the shootdown happens at the time when there is a serious effort to reform the domestic system, and the system is truly opening up. And I think Matthew is going to talk a little bit about how much the Americans knew about what was going on in the Soviet Union. So I think I will provide a little bit of context to that. And unfortunately, after the U-2 shootdown, the window of opportunity for Khrushchev to achieve both goals, domestically and internationally, if not closes, then narrows down substantially. And if you look at major histories of the Soviet Union and of the Cold War, sometimes this episode is not presented as such a big turning point. But I think in a way it is a significant event, and a significant event with some serious implications. Before I go into my presentation, I have to tell you that I am really not a specialist on this period. I am more of a specialist on the end of the Cold War, but I did some work on the Khrushchev period. And I strongly recommend that if you really were interested in understanding the Soviet reaction and why the U-2 shoot-down was so important, you should look at two very important books. One is by Vlad Zubak, The Failed Empire, and the other one is the Khrushchev biography by Bill Tauman. So let me just step back a little bit from 1960 and look at what is happening in the Soviet Union in the couple of years before. I'm sure everybody heard about the 20th century and the secret speech and the effort of de-Stalinization, which by the end of 1956 kind of winds down with student demonstrations in December, of course after the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution. But it does not stop. It winds down. Khrushchev becomes more cautious. Khrushchev sees the possible implications of his de-Stalinization campaign. He finds opposition. He finds constraints. But the de-Stalinization and his effort to open up the system do not stop. Another major event that happens before that, in the summer of 1955, is an unprecedented game between the German soccer team and the Soviet soccer team. And it might sound as not completely relevant, but it's an indicator of how much the Soviet Union was opening up. Because if you look at especially the dissident writings and the liberal intelligentsia writings, that is the event that everybody remembers. And especially Yevgeny Yevtushenko, probably the poet of Soviet liberal intelligentsia at the time, saw that match as the turning point, where the society began accepting its history, was willing to reconcile even with the ultimate enemy, the Germans. The German team was eventually welcomed and accepted, even though initially there was a very cautious reception. Then in the summer of 1957, we have the World Youth Festival in Moscow. And that is something that never happened in the Soviet Union before. Foreigners were allowed to communicate with Soviet citizens, although only in Moscow, but still it was a very hopeful event, a very optimistic event. Things were developing in maybe not so radical way that you might expect from the speech of 1956, but domestic opening was actually building throughout the late 1950s. So this is the context for the shoot-down of the U-2. Domestic opening. The second major factor that I would like to present as an explanatory variable for why the reaction was the way it happened is Khrushchev's personality. And I think without looking at Khrushchev's personality, his very deeply held views, it is hard to understand why does the U-2 shoot-down become such an important turning point in the Cold War. Khrushchev was very emotional, in a way erratic. He had this strange mixture of extreme pride and at the same time a very strong inferiority complex because of his background. As a peasant, he used to repeat that he was working with cows and goats as a teenager and then rose to the highest post in the Soviet Union. That made him proud of his personal journey, of his achievement, but at the same time, it made him extremely sensitive to slight, extremely sensitive to disrespect or any signs of disrespect that he could see around him. He also deeply believed, and every time I say deeply believed, I mean it because Khrushchev held his views very strongly. He had very strong assumptions, very strong opinions. He changed them from time to time. And once he changed them, then his next belief or his next opinion was also held very strongly. But once he had a certain belief or opinion, it blinded him to other possibilities. And we will see it throughout the process of what followed the shoot-down. He believed that Soviet Union could surpass the United States in economic development, in living standards. He did not just declare that communism was winning, he genuinely believed in it. But then in 1959, and that is also why I'm saying that the timing for shootdown was so terrible. In September 1959, Khrushchev goes on his famous trip to the United States, and he travels throughout the United States. And he meets with ordinary Americans, he meets with businessmen, he meets with politicians, and he develops strong liking toward Americans, simple people on the street. He starts liking Eisenhower. He gets attached to the politicians whom he meets on the trip, partially because he feels that they show him real respect and appreciation. He goes to the United States with this feeling of inferiority complex. He constantly compares everything. He compares the planes. He refuses to fly on an ill plane. He decides to fly on Tu-114 plane because that looks more modern and like the ones that Americans have. So he's so sensitive to any inferiority signs. And then suddenly in the United States he's feted, he's celebrated, he is respected as an equal, and to him it means that he develops real friendship with Eisenhower. He's infatuated with Eisenhower, and he talks about it when he comes back. And I would just like to mention very briefly what Dino Burgioni said in his presentation. Why is that he writes this memoir where he complains about overflights and asks the overflights to be stopped, and then on the trip he does not touch upon the subject? It is a mystery that I also encountered when I was preparing this paper. And I think at least to a large part, it is because this is a very contentious issue. And once he becomes this, once he develops this sensation of friendship and closeness to Eisenhower and American politicians, he believes that this friendship, this new warmth, will automatically prevail and would automatically destroy the suspicion on both sides, and he also wants to avoid any confrontational subjects, which is very, very interesting because I mostly study Gorbachev and I see the same trait. If there is a controversial, contentious subject in a face-to-face contact, Gorbachev tries to avoid it and not mention it, and many people then later, of course, criticize him for that. But I see that happening during that trip, where all the conversation essentially is about cooperative project, about what the Soviet Union can learn. When Khrushchev comes back, he is a different person. He developed a real respect for America, but another interesting development is that for the first time in his conversations when he comes back, he starts questioning the successes and even sometimes the viability of the communist system that they have at home. Of course, we all heard about his experiments with doing things American ways, the most famous one being planting corn everywhere where it was possible, where it wouldn't grow even in principle. But this is really, he comes back questioning his domestic system for the first time. And during his dinner, actually, yes, it's the New Year's dinner for the party elite, and he also invites U.S. Ambassador Llewellyn Thompson, and he talks to him about his impressions from the trip, and his projections for U.S.-Soviet relations are so optimistic. He now thinks that he can achieve everything with his friend Eisenhower. The third moment that I would like to stop on is that at the moment Khrushchev goes through a major redesigning of his domestic priorities, and he is looking to the future where he's going to catch up and surpass the United States, while he's already beginning to question the possibility of that. If you really want to reform the Soviet economy and the Soviet system, he believes you need to divert the money from the military-industrial complex and develop domestic economy, and then requires enormous investment, which becomes even clearer for him after his trip to the United States. Now, he believes he is capable of reforming his relations with the United States, with his friend Eisenhower. He does not see that much of a conflict. He believes that the competition between capitalism and socialism can be peaceful, and in the end, the society that achieves higher living standards will win. That is the Soviet Union, of course. And then the value of military forces becomes much lower in his mind. So already in 1955-57, even before he goes to the United States, he makes a decision to reduce the armed forces by 2 million men. In the end of 1959, coming back from the United States, he makes several very major disarmament initiatives. In September 1959, he calls at the General Assembly, he calls for general and complete disarmament. He genuinely believed that elimination of ballistic missiles and bombers would be possible. And he was willing to agree to verification, but he saw verification a little differently, and I will talk about it a little later. In December 1959, he writes a letter, a memorandum to his presidium, arguing for an even deeper reduction of the conventional military forces. He argues for reduction of the Soviet army by 1.2 million men again in the beginning of 1960. In January 1960, the Supreme Soviet obviously unanimously votes for this reduction, and at the Presidium discussion and at the discussion of the Supreme Soviet, there is not a single objection. This is what you would expect in the Soviet Union, but at the same time, the second reduction really rubs military the wrong way, because it's not just the reduction of soldiers, it's also the reduction of 250 officers. And this tension, if not yet open opposition, begins to build. Interestingly enough, the person who probably saw more clearly than others how vulnerable that reduction would make the Soviet Union was his defense minister, Rodion Malinovsky. And he generally becomes this channel through whom the more conservative military, the military opposed to the cuts, expressed their opinion. So Khrushchev was always very sensitive to what Malinovsky would say, even though he did not directly challenge him on the cuts. And Brezhnev did not directly challenge him on the cuts, but Brezhnev clearly was in the opposition, and from this moment this opposition starts to grow. Khrushchev believed that you could go, if you cannot immediately achieve complete and general disarmament, which means complete elimination of strategic weapons, ballistic missiles and bombers, then you can keep the mutual deterrence at a very low level. And what did it mean? It meant that, believe it or not, at the time when the Soviet Union had only 4 operational ballistic missiles, which is early 1960, they had 4 R-7 ballistic missiles. Khrushchev believed that maybe doubling that arsenal would be enough for the minimal deterrence. That would be enough for the minimal deterrence. But at the same time, he felt very acutely that the Soviet Union was falling behind, and he felt that he needed to present a picture of the Soviet Union actually being ahead of the United States in their strategic potential. And this is where all his bragging about this one factory is producing 250 ballistic missiles a year and we could increase the production. He believed that by that bluster and by that rhetoric, he could persuade the United States to actually start disarmament, because he knew that the United States believed there was a missile gap. It was quite a complicated game. He thought that if the United States believed that the Soviet Union was very weak, if the United States knew how little the Soviets had in terms of strategic weapons, they would never negotiate on elimination. However, if they thought the Soviet Union was ahead of them, he did not realize that the United States would have this sense of threat. He thought that would pressure the United States into negotiating to lower and then destroy them. And that is where the issue of verification comes in. Khrushchev was not actually against verification as such. He was against the open skies proposal by Eisenhower, and in fact we know that Marshal Zhukov is fired in 1956 over his support and endorsement of open skies proposal. Khrushchev was afraid that if he allows the spy planes to overfly the Soviet territory, the Americans would discover that they didn't have anything, that they were so weak. He agrees to verification, but only after the weapons are destroyed. And the United States cannot accept that condition. But the reason why the Soviet Union can allow very deep verification only after the weapons are destroyed, because he didn't want to show how weak they were. So at this moment, where the Soviet Union drastically reduced its armed forces, with the latest reduction announced in January 1960, they reduced the forces more than by a third of the number that they had before 57. It is at this moment when Khrushchev is very optimistic about the US-Soviet relations, about his the coming Geneva summit, about the possibility of achieving resolution on Berlin. It is at this moment that the overflight happens and the plane is shot down. And what's also interesting, you can see it in the documents, you can see it very well in the memoir written by his son, that immediately after the shoot-down, Khrushchev does not actually connect what happened with Eisenhower. He still believes that Eisenhower did not know about it. It must be Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, it must be the military, it must be some dark forces who are doing it behind Eisenhower's back. And that is why the fact that U-2 overflight occurred and it was shot down does not alter his optimism going into the Geneva summit. Even during the Geneva summit, he is not sure that Eisenhower was involved, even though it was now stated publicly by the United States, by Eisenhower's spokesman, that Eisenhower authorized the flights. Khrushchev refuses to believe it, and his goal, he thinks he is playing a very clever game. Again, his main goal is to get the United States to agree to this very deep disarmament and to the settlement on Berlin. So he thinks that by shaming the United States publicly, he can get the United States to apologize, to feel guilty, and therefore be more flexible in making concessions on what Khrushchev was looking for. Therefore, he does not inform the United States that they have the plane, pieces of the plane, that they have the photography, that they have the pilot. He is waiting for them to construct the story. We know all the details, and then, of course, he denounces them, still believing that Eisenhower has nothing to do with that. Well, slowly, as he goes into Geneva summit, it dawns on him that it's not happening. And again, this, I think, a lot of insight should be found in the way Khrushchev himself saw the coming meeting, saw Eisenhower, saw their relationship. He had only one strategy. All he wanted is for Eisenhower to apologize, and after that he was willing to negotiate. Once, after repeated ultimatums, Khrushchev finds out that Eisenhower would not apologize, even though Eisenhower actually promises that there would be no more U-2 overflights. You would think Khrushchev achieved this big victory that he wanted, but he doesn't see it as a victory because his point is to get Eisenhower to apologize. Once that becomes not an option, Khrushchev does not have a strategy and reacts purely emotionally and really erupts and starts going out of control, behaving unpredictably, really embarrassing his negotiating team. Mikoyan wrote later about it. Troyanovsky wrote about it. Even Gromyko was very critical of Khrushchev. So they go back without having achieved anything at the Geneva summit, and the summit ends in complete collapse, and the Eisenhower visit to the Soviet Union is practically cancelled. Although when Khrushchev goes back, he doesn't think that they have to cancel the visit. He still believes that his friend will come around. But his own assessment of the summit is a betrayal, and that's what he says everywhere. I was betrayed. My friend betrayed me. I can't trust Eisenhower any longer. Now, what happens after the Geneva summit is very interesting. Khrushchev does not immediately realize that something irreparable happened. He thinks he still can go on with his idea of general disarmament. And in fact, on June 7, 1960, the Soviet delegation in Geneva makes a formal proposal for destruction of all strategic missiles, launchers, and bombers as the first step in general disarmament. It is not propaganda. It is a genuine belief of Khrushchev, and it's a repeated statement of his goals. And the proposal includes this on verification, that all disarmament measures will be carried out under strict international control from the beginning to the end. Again, with one caveat: the foreign inspectors would be permitted on the Russian soil after the weapons are destroyed. So now I would like to talk about the consequences. What really is there a long-term impact of this U-2 shoot-down? And as I said, most historians, I think, don't pay too much attention. Maybe Bill Taubman, I would say, is more sensitive to what a blow internally the shutdown and collapse of the Geneva summit was. But Mikoyan, actually, in his memoirs, says that the shutdown of the U-2 postponed détente by at least 15 years. What happens is that for the military conservative critics of Khrushchev, for the critics of his disarmament program and unilateral reduction of arms forces, this is the sign, this is the symbol that you can't trust the Americans. This is the symbol that Khrushchev's disarmament is another harebrained scheme, which he was later accused at the plenum in 1964 when they removed him, clearly talking about that particular proposal of disarmament. This failure and the very emotional response leads, not directly, but it's the same kind of train of emotional responses that lead Khrushchev to bang his shoe in the United Nations, creating truly strange and threatening image of him in the West that he is very sensitive to. He realizes what he looks like to the West. So Khrushchev himself, what is very interesting, remembers this moment as a turning point, and he talks later in his retirement to one of his American guests, and he says this. He says about the U-2 and what happened as a result of the U-2. He says, things were going well until one thing happened. From the time Gary Powers was shot down in the U-2 over the Soviet Union, I was no longer in full control. Those who felt that America had imperialist intentions and that military strength was the most important thing had the evidence they needed. And when the U-2 accident occurred, I no longer had the ability to overcome that feeling. So for him, he saw that as a turning point of sorts, where he becomes weaker domestically and unable to deliver internationally on his plans and intentions. But maybe there is a lesson that was learned during the immediate follow-up of the shoot-down. And that, this is kind of conjecture, and I'm not sure we could truly say this is the lesson he carried to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what he does in the U-2 incident is that he completely puts Eisenhower into the corner. He does not give Eisenhower any way to save face. All his strategy is built on one outcome that he is pursuing: to shame him publicly and demand an apology. And then he would be willing to negotiate. And it completely fails. If we look at how Khrushchev deals with Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's completely different. He understands the need to save face. He understands the needs for private initiatives and not talking publicly about most sensitive issues. For example, the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. He sends Dobrynin to discuss that issue. And he backs down. He changes his argument. He is willing to change his strategy in a very flexible way, negotiating with the opponent and not just dealing with him by ultimatums. So I would say it is a missed opportunity for détente, but it's also an incident that led Khrushchev to learn some significant lessons that eventually maybe made the world a little safer during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Svetlana, and I don't think you needed to be in the least bit defensive about your not having the technical background, because that was an excellent exposition of the politics, I thought. I think I'll offer one comment. You, like me, offered that question about why he didn't raise the subject of the flights during his visit to the US. And the only thing I would suggest here is, if you remember from my presentation, there hadn't been a flight for 15 months from March 58, and we now know that the Soviets didn't detect the flight in July of 59, and they didn't detect the next one in November. I think the visit was in September. So maybe he just thought it was over. And the protest note had prevailed in March of 58.
That's a good explanation.
Right. Let's move on. We've got Charles Whittle to speak next. Charles is the Washington bureau chief for the Times of London newspaper. So I've got a fellow Brit here. Charles has been based in Times bureaus all over the world, including Moscow and Los Angeles. He's written 4 previous books, including Lambada Country and Extreme Continental, describing his travels by bike and motorbike through Eastern Europe and Central Asia during the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he's also written Spitfire Women of World War II, which is not about their personal traits, it's about the aeroplane that they flew. His next book is going to be Bridge of Spies, a true story of the Cold War, and that is based on the Soviet-US exchange of powers for KGB's Colonel William Fischer, a.k.a. Rudolf Abel, on Berlin's Gleinica Bridge in February of 1962. Giles.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Whenever I am reminded of the title of my first book, I wince, because it should really have been about dancers in Brazil and fun stuff like that, but it was about a rather lonely bicycle ride through Eastern Europe. Lambada Country. Let me just... I'm very honoured to be here as a mere... Oh, that gives the game away. Dear me. Is there any way that we can just have the white screen to start with? Ha!
Slide 1.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. Okay, well...
Maximise.
And then you show when you're ready for the slideshow?
let's go straight to slide 2.
You
That's
can
fine.
close, see that little cross?
Oh, yes,
you
yes,
can
yes.
close the slides on the left. Yeah, yeah.
View show. View show? No.
Yeah. And then you just play when you need it.
Yeah. There you go.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not a PowerPoint expert, unlike the Pentagon, if any of you read the New York Times yesterday. But I am very honoured to be here as a mere fourth estater. I came to this story not as a specialist or as a participant, but as a journalist for whom it has always struck me as what we call in Fleet Street a cracking yarn. It has everything, including, for those of you who are familiar with the writings of Barbara Powers, quite a lot of sex. Maybe you're not, but she wrote a memoir called Spy Wife. I recommend it to you all.
I read it on the plane coming over for the first time.
It was introduced to me in 1992 by 2 Soviet frontier guards who were giving me a ride from what used to be Stalinabad and is now Dushanbe. Am I right about that? Along the frontier road to Osh, which is still called Osh in Kyrgyzstan, and about halfway along they pointed with great pride to some white domes on the horizon near the Afghan border and said, that is where we brought down, that is where we picked up Gary Powers. And what was striking was that they were about my age, born well after this event, and they used the word we. Tremendous national pride in having brought him down, pride that will probably be reflected in events that his son, who we just saw off at the airport, will be attending in Moscow this weekend to mark the 50th anniversary. The result of that encounter many years later for me is a book that really should have been published on Saturday, but because of the vagaries of the American publishing industry, will be published in October. As Chris said, it's about the U-2 affair, but also the spy swap that followed it in February '62, and all the participants in that swap, 2 of whom are still alive. My secret hope as a journalist was to stumble on evidence that enabled me to stand up, prove one or more of the conspiracy theories surrounding the U-2 affair. Perhaps I would be able to show that Lee Harvey Oswald really did give the flight plan to the Soviets. Perhaps I'd be able to show that Gary Powers really did glide down to 30,000 feet and defect and spend the night in a Sverdlovsk nightclub. This was a semi-serious quest. Just to give you an idea, after I first met Gary Powers Jr. From Richmond Airport down the road in Virginia, I made a call to Marvin Mackinnon, one of 2 American students who were eventually freed as part of the chief swap between Powers and Abel, a.k.a. Fisher. And he still works. He's not in the room, is he? This story is somewhat at his expense. As a researcher at the university, as a professor at the University of Chicago. And I explained my business, and he interrupted me and said, you do know that Powers was not shot down, don't you? He said, I know more about this than anyone in the world. And I said, really? Yes, he said, I shared a cell with his cellmate in Vladimir, which he did. And I thought, this is it, this is my scoop. And he said, do you want to talk about it now on the telephone, or do you want to come and see me? And I said, I'll come and see you. You know, I assumed that I would be arrested if we had this conversation over the phone. And so I spent $600 of money that I didn't really have on a round-trip ticket that night to Chicago, and we sat down in his office, and I got to that subject as quickly as possible. How do you know that he was not shot down? Well, he said, in the 80s I was a student at the LSE, and I used to spend my evenings looking at History Channel documentaries. And on one of them, they said clear as day that it was a Norwegian documentary about a bomb put in the tail section of the fuselage. That's how he came down. So my heart sank. I knew that was not my scoop. One of the more serious doubters of the what has become the conventional wisdom of what happened on May 1st was and is James Nathan. the author of an article he entitled A Fragile Détente, the U-2 Incident Re-Examined, similar to the title of today's event, published in Military Affairs in October 1975. That article pulled together every reported aspect of Operation Grand Slam that Nathan found implausible as an observer, not as a participant. And he concluded that it was a provocation mounted by unidentified factions within the US intelligence or defense community and designed to fail, thereby scuppering the summit and détente. And about a year ago, I emailed Professor Nathan to ask if he still believed in this theory, and about a month ago he emailed back to say that he did, for what it's worth. I think he's wrong. The fact is that no conspirator seeking to prolong the Cold War could have come up with anything as convoluted as a failed Operation Grand Slam. Nor could he have dreamed of pulling off such a spectacular success. It was the effects of Power's last overflight that gave rise to the conspiracy theories, not the other way round. As Svetlana has already indicated, the main reason for Soviet skepticism about Power's version of the shoot-down was that its effects seemed to suit so perfectly the interests of what Eisenhower himself would shortly describe as the American military-industrial complex, a complex with, and I quote, the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power if the next president failed to rein it in. And the main reason for American skepticism over the years, and immediately after Power's return of Power's version of events, was a closely held 36-minute NSA trace of Soviet chatter and radar, and Matthew may know more about this than I do, that seemed to indicate an aircraft gliding down from about 70 to about 30,000 feet south of Sverdlovsk, and a pilot then bailing out. And that, to those in the know, seemed to conflict with the idea of being hit and bailing out at 70,000 feet after the now famous orange glow of an exploding surface-to-air missile. Now, rather than give a blow-by-blow account of a story that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, I'll try to give a little added value by concentrating on three distinct points of view. The first is that of an old friend, I think, of Chris's, Colonel Stan Beerley of the Air Force and latterly of the CIA. I have some pictures of him, but forgive me, they are stuck on another computer. This is not Colonel Stan Beerley. He's now in his 90s and still thriving on a hillside, I believe, in northern Oregon. And as Chris was the first to explain in any detail, he devised what he called Operation Quick Move, a procedure by which some of the most ambitious Soviet overflights were kept secret. They'd involved a single C-130, just enough barrels of fuel, just enough personnel, no more. Now, on May 1st, 1960, Beerley, who had been commander of Detachment 210s, in Adana, was not there. He was in Norway, waiting for the flight that never arrived. He told me that he did not know, until he returned to Washington, that the mission had originally been planned for April 27th. That may be the case. It may be an eroding memory, but it's interesting. He also said that he did not know until he returned to Washington that Power's original U-2 and its replacement were shuttled back and forth between Adana and Peshawar a total of 5 times between the 27th and the night of April 30th. And this was not how Quick Move was meant to work. Can you think of any better way to telegraph to the Russians that we were coming, he asked me. I could not. So, it is just possible to speculate that a villain in the agency or the Air Force was deliberately blowing the operation's cover. And it has to be said that Beerley was generally unimpressed with his successor, Colonel William Shelton, an Air Force man. But I say only just possible. It is entirely reasonable to suppose that one way or another the mission's cover was blown by the time Powers took off. Apart from anything, as Chris has written in detail, the final go had been sent over an open radio channel from Turkey to Pakistan. Any number of Soviet eavesdroppers in the Caucasus could have picked it up and may well have done so. This didn't mean that Grand Slam was doomed, far from it. The fact that takeoff was eventually approved for the Mayday holiday probably made it less likely, not more, that it would be intercepted. Holidays were holidays. Most Soviet citizens had the day off, and Soviet legend has it that Major Mikhail Voronov, however, stayed at his post. Here he is. This is the man credited over the years in the Soviet Union with shooting down Gary Powers. When I found him at his home on the Black Sea a few days before his 90th birthday, he described in lucid detail how his experience as an anti-aircraft gunner at the Battle of Kursk prepared him for this day, how he let some, but not all of his officers go into Sverdlovsk that morning to have some fun, and how, when the alarm sounded in his encampment outside the village of Kosolino at about 7 a.m., his unit was ready. "Was I asleep?" he said in answer to a question from me that was clearly dumb. "Of course I was asleep. It was the 1st of May. I was planning to walk over from the barracks to give my soldiers their traditional Mayday congratulations. Instead, I ran. We all did. We rushed to our positions. And when we got there, I told my commander that my battalion was ready to fire, ready to push the button. An hour later, the button was duly pushed, and Voronov watched the one missile that actually launched close on its target on his radar screen and destroy it." Let's see if this works.
It doesn't work very well, I noticed.
Is there an alternative?
Yes, on the...
On the computer. Just
That one?
Yeah.
There we go. Many of you will recognize this typical, very generous spread. Voronov, as I say, emerged as the official hero of the shoot-down and retired early on a generous pension. The story he told me is the approved version that he told everyone who has asked him over the last 50 years, but that doesn't make it wrong. And here he is describing the bullseye, or the near bullseye, that changed the course of history. The finger is the rocket, and Powers' plane is his left hand. And here is one of his junior officers that day, former Lieutenant Nikolai Batukhtin, in front of the encampment from where the rocket was fired. We asked to be let in, but despite Batukhtin's record, we weren't. This is the ground view of what you've already seen as a slide from the air, and what Ambassador Garthov photographed on his approach to Sverdlovsk airport in '59. Batukhtin was in charge of the guidance system for one of the 6 rockets that did not launch that day, because, he said to me, the angle of fire would have been too acute. It had to be, as I recall, above 63 degrees. I'm not entirely clear why the system prevented launch below 63 degrees, but I assume it's to do with the exhaust plume and its potential to damage everything around it. He was therefore free, because he wasn't tracking the active missile, to step outside the control cabin and watch the one that did launch disappear into the heavens. And he says he heard a distant explosion and minutes later saw the debris start to fall from the sky. Batukhtin's and Yekaterinburg's pride in the S-75 or the SA-2 is undimmed all these years later. Here he is standing in front of one of the flying telegraph poles in downtown Sverdlovsk 18 months ago. The last discrete point of view to note today is that of Powers, because he was there, he survived, and everyone who knew him well, unlike people like DCI John McCone, insists that he was honest, perhaps to a fault. His published account of the shoot-down suffers a little from having been written 10 years after the event and submitted to the CIA for approval. But the version he gave his debriefers on February the 13th, 1962, 3 days after his exchange for Abel or Fischer outside Berlin, was less sanitized but no less gripping. And you can see from the long paragraphs, this is just one page of many. It was a stream of consciousness Cold War classic. Because the anniversary is coming up, it warrants, I don't know if you can read it from where you are, but in case you can't, I think out of respect to the pilot, we ought to read a few words from this. This is a pretty key moment in his life and in history. I'll just read from the top. Everything was perfect. The only thing wrong with the aircraft was the autopilot pitch control, and I wasn't using the autopilot. This, as you will know, is a few miles south of Sverdlovsk. I'd been straight and level on this particular leg of 1 or 2 minutes. Everything was lined up and started taking my readings, and then the explosion. I remember saying to myself, or saying out loud, I don't know. I think it was, oh God, I've had it now, something like that. The first thing that entered my mind, and I couldn't tell you how much time passed, it would be impossible. It just seemed that everything was standing still for a little while. I just saw that red glow. Interestingly, he uses red there and orange everywhere else, but that's probably not that significant. I looked down, the right wing started to drop. I corrected it and brought the right wing up fine. The nose started to drop, and I pulled back on the stick, and there was no connection between the controls and the tail, and the plane just nosed straight over. And I feel sure that the wings broke off broadside of the wind that way. They must have folded down this way and came off. The airplane tumbled on over. And he goes on uninterrupted by his interrogators for a long while. 11 days later, as part of the Prettyman inquiry, Powers agreed to polygraph, having been made aware of the radar trace picked up by the NSA that seemed to contradict his version of events. Asked if he continued flying at all beyond Sverdlovsk and whether he had withheld anything from his agency interrogators, he, quote, showed some tension, unquote, according to the lie detector expert, whose identity I'm afraid is redacted and I don't know. And he said, gentlemen, I've got this radar staring me in the face. They say I did and I say I didn't. Meaning they say I came down from 70,000 feet, and I say I didn't. He was told he could forget about the radar trace. The question was asked again, and the tension disappeared. He passed the polygraph with flying colours. The Prettyman report disposed to most people's satisfaction with the theories that Powers was hypnotized, brainwashed, drugged, or otherwise induced to fabricate his story of the shoot-down. It even dealt with a suggestion of something called hysterical amnesia, but it still didn't please John McCone, the new Director of Central Intelligence, who never believed Powers' story, as far as I can tell. He asked pointed follow-up questions about a woman from Beirut, who he claimed was a known Soviet agent, and with whom Powers was rumoured to have associated in Turkey. And he also asked about the NSA trace. Forgive the quality of this picture. It's taken through glass at the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow. They wouldn't let me remove the glass. A press card will only get you so far. Only since the Cold War has it become clear that the NSA was probably confusing Powers for Captain Boris Evasyan, or, more likely, Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov, both in MiGs that morning with orders to try to shoot him down, which they failed to do. Safronov, who, unlike his wingman, failed to dive fast enough to avoid the rockets fired by other battalions to the south of Sverdlovsk that morning, was found dead beside his parachute. So Safronov was one casualty of the shoot-down. Was world peace another? I am inclined to agree with almost everything that Svetlana said. It's certainly by no means a crazy question. Taubman and Naftali Fesenko, not to mention Khrushchev's son, have shown that he was entirely serious in early 1960 about deep permanent disarmament. The shoot-down destroyed the summit, but also Eisenhower's stature as a peacemaker. Nixon, his vice president, suffered commensurately as a presidential candidate. The shoot-down also enabled Alan Dulles, the outgoing DCI, to look Kennedy in the eye on a visit to the Kennedy compound at Hyannis in the summer of 1960 and say that he could not state for certain that the missile gap did not exist. Kennedy continued to use the missile gap as a campaign issue and won the White House by the narrowest margin since 1916. On the day of his inauguration, his last social call in January 61 was to his old friend and missile gap fearmonger, the columnist Joe Alsop. So early in the morning of January 21st, 1961, they enjoyed turtle soup together in Alsop's Georgetown residence. They might have done exactly that without the U-2 affair, but in very different circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Giles. Could you swap around? I think they're right. I'm just going to amplify something you said about Stan Beerley, who was the commander of Det 1010 or Det B out in Turkey, and the designer of Fast Move, until he was posted back to Washington to become the deputy and the subsequent replacement for the Air Force colonel running the program in Washington. Because this has come up before, Beerley was involved in the development of the diversionary flight strategy that I mentioned, whereby while a flight was being launched out of Pakistan in all of those last 4 successful flights and the Powers flight, there would be a flight launched out of the home base at Turkey to go along the border and then come back again to Turkey, and would deliberately not fly into the Soviet Union but would fly within the early warning radar coverage. There was, you can see it in the more recently declassified cables, there is some debate within the project as to whether this is a good idea or not, but they decided to go ahead with it anyway. And insofar as the U-2 was actually doing border flights in late 59 and into 1960, it wasn't necessarily unusual and an alerting of the Soviets, because from about the middle of 59, a telemetry intelligence sensor had been developed and put onto the U-2, and because it flew so high, the hope was that there would be SIGINT tip-offs of the countdowns for the ICBM at Turatam, which would enable the U-2 to launch and be in a good position in friendly territory, Iran, at 70,000 feet, for that TELINT sensor to get the vital first stage burn data from the R7 ICBM. And so Beerley was part of that. But as Giles said, what was new for the Powers flight alone, not on any of those previous 4 flights, was the fact that either the commander in the field, Colonel Shelton, or Colonel Burke back in headquarters decided that if the flight could not be flown because of weather, instead of keeping the plane in the hangar at Peshawar and awaiting 24 hours, they would ferry the airplane back to Turkey. Doesn't make any sense to me, because they could have hid it in the hangar. But this happened 3 times because the flight was delayed for weather in the 27th of April through to the 1st of May. So that's just to clarify that. And that is what Beerley objected to. He didn't know anything about it. And I was privileged to have dinner with Beerley and Colonel Burke on the occasion of the 1997 conference here, when that subject came up, and there was a very awkward discussion between those 2 colonels. Right, we're going on to our last speaker. It's Matthew Aid.
There's one thing that we found kind of interesting. Never did we see an alert of the troops at Turatam. They knew that we were flying over Turatam. Not once did we see an indication that they were alert there. And to me, of all places to be alert, that would have been one, because it was a perpetual target of ours.
Yeah.
Did Powers not assume that the first contrails that he saw, were launched from there, were they not?
Yeah, on the Mayday flight, I think they were in bed. The SA-2.
They had SA-2s around there. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Anyway, Maybe we can get into this in the discussion period, but Matthew is a leading intelligence historian. He's a visiting fellow at the George Washington University's National Security Archive again, and I might add a good friend who's been very helpful to me over the years. In February of 2006, Matthew's discovery of a massive secret historical document reclassification program then taking place at the National Archives, his discovery made the front page of the New York Times. His book, The Secret Century, The Untold History of the National Security Agency, details a story of America's most elusive and powerful intelligence organization. Matthew is a regular commentator on intelligence matters for the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Associated Press, CBS News, NPR, and many other media outlets. Gosh, how do you find the time? He lives here in Washington, D.C.
Can you all hear me? I just want to make sure this thing is working. I realize I'm the last speaker. We're approaching the end of the day. Some of you are probably on your last drop of caffeine from coffee drunk earlier today. So I'll try and keep this short, brief, and as exciting as possible. First of all, for those of you who are former or current employees of the Central Intelligence Agency, I fully sympathize with you in the sense that asking someone who writes and knows about the National Security Agency to get the last word on any topic is generally grounds for a civil war within the intelligence community. So I will try to keep this as nonpartisan as possible. It will come as no surprise to those of you who are intelligence veterans that the National Security Agency was involved in all facets of the U-2 program from its very beginning to its unfortunate demise on Mayday 1960, and was deeply involved in the events surrounding Gary Powers' unfortunate overflight. What I'd like to do is go back a little further than other speakers have done today for the simple reason to try and explain why the U-2 was so important. Joseph Stalin dies in March 1953, 2 months after Dwight D. Eisenhower is inaugurated. Within the intelligence community at the time, there was enormous hope that Stalin's death would lead to the equivalent of intelligence glasnost, that suddenly all the barriers that had prevented the U.S. intelligence community from accessing the deepest, darkest secrets of what was going on in the Kremlin would crumble, and suddenly Pravda and Izvestia would start publishing true accounts of what was actually going on in the country, and that the CIA could openly operate in the country. It didn't happen. One of the strangest things when you read the declassified documents is that rather than, everything Svetlana said is absolutely true. I mean, I have no doubt that Khrushchev in his mind really was looking for, rapprochement, some sense of an opening to the United States, perhaps realizing that an arms race would prevent him from doing the things that he wanted to do with the Russian economy, and to make Russia a true superpower. That said, there was another entity involved. It was called the Ministry for State Security, or MGB, which did not necessarily think along the same lines as Nikita Khrushchev. I've read the CIA annual reports and some of the assessments that were coming in. The MGB actually tightened the screws after Stalin's death in March 1953. There's a famous meeting where Allen Dulles sits down with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1954 and says, we're getting less out of Russia than we were while Stalin was still alive. Where our human intelligence networks the CIA had basically given up trying to parachute agents into Russia. open source intelligence, which was a pretty iffy source to begin with in terms of depending on provenance vestia for much of what you knew about Soviet decision-making. The Russians suddenly stopped printing economic statistics, which we had depended on to try and determine what the Soviet economy was doing. So there's this meeting in 1954 where Basic Allen Dulles says, look, we're down to technical intelligence. Traditional intelligence sources are not working. Open source is not giving us the kind of information that we need to base, good analysis on. So we have to look at signals intelligence, which at the time was providing 90% of the warning intelligence that the U.S. military needed in case the Russian military came across the border, from East Germany. To be dependent on one single source of intelligence for 90% of your information, I think any intelligence professional, regardless of what country they come from, will tell you is really dangerous. So in November 1954, the board is formed under Thomas Land. They examine the issue and they say, look, we got to examine the prospects of overhead photography. We can't depend on SIGINT and electronic intelligence or ELINT for everything that we know about the Soviet Union. So the first thing that happens, Eisenhower approves the U-2 program. NSA at this point is, there's a massive report in the CREST database up at the National Archives. It's like 300 pages long. It's written at the top secret code word level. And it's the Hoover Commission's 1954 assessment of the value of the National Security Agency as opposed to clandestine intelligence gathering, aerial photography, and all the other sources combined. It's actually a remarkable document. And it's now online at the National Security Archive, the digital National Security Archive website. What's fascinating about it is that the document says that unless something is done and done soon, SIGINT is going to lose its credibility and its viability as a source of intelligence. So we have to come up with something else other than signals intelligence. So NSA moves into an alliance, an unhappy alliance, I should point out, with the Central Intelligence Agency on the U-2 program. NSA product is mined furiously for targets within the Soviet Union that the U-2 can cover during the first series of canned missions in 1956. But NSA is denied what it deems to be an adequate number of billets with talent clearances. For those of you who don't know the story, NSA and the CIA have never had a particularly happy relationship. For those of you who remember a show called The Battling Bickersons, that probably best describes what the NSA-CIA relationship has historically been like. So what I'm about to describe is how a symbiotic relationship between two agencies that didn't particularly like each other very much developed and became really critical to the importance of the U-2 program. And we have to remember that Gary Powers was not the end of the U-2 program, because we began overflying the People's Republic of China from Taiwan in January 1962. And while we conducted 24 overflights of the Soviet Union between 1956 and 1960, we conducted 108 overflights of the People's Republic of China between 1962 and the time that Secretary of State Rusk ended the program in 1968. By the way, the pilots were not Americans. They were Chinese nationalist Air Force pilots who have never gotten the recognition that they deserve. So here's the way it worked. During the initial stage of the U-2 program, NSA's function, as it still is today, was to provide intelligence reporting of Soviet air defense reactions to the flight. Now, Chris has correctly pointed out that once the U-2 pilot was in the air, there was no communications with the ground. The HF radio on the plane was basically shut off for security purposes. So the NSA monitors listening to Soviet air defense radar operators tracking the plane even if they picked up an indication in the intercepts that the Soviets were going to try and shoot that plane down and activated weapon systems, there was no way under the system in place at the time that they could warn the U-2 pilot that his life could be measured in a matter of nanoseconds. This changed over time, but it took the loss of a lot of American lives flying other reconnaissance missions before NSA finally said, okay, fine, we'll tell uncleared Air Force or CIA pilots that their missions are in danger. That's how concerned we were about the security of signals intelligence at the time. So we flew the first 5 missions over the Soviet Union in 1956, 3 in July and 2 later on in the fall. Then something remarkable happens. NSA's function at this point was basically routine support. I mean, it's important what NSA was getting. Every time a U-2 entered the Soviet airspace, the entire Soviet air defense system, which its initials are PVO, Противовоздушной обороны, the PVO air defense system communication nets lit up like a Christmas tree every time the U-2 entered Soviet airspace. You cannot believe the look of joy of NSA analysts sitting back at Fort Meade in 1956 watching the reams of intelligence come pouring in after each and every U-2 overflight. They literally, in a 4-year period between 56 and 60, were basically able to dissect much of the Soviet air defense system. They could tell you how capable it was, what its strengths were there gaps in its radar coverage, and more importantly, I've talked to a number of SAC intelligence officers, who looked at the data. They said, with this stuff, we could guarantee the B-47s and B-52s that, had the job of penetrating Soviet airspace, a la Dr. Strangelove, could actually get through the Soviet air defense systems, thanks in large part to the intelligence that was being collected by NSA, through the auspices of the U-2 program. That said, it probably was not NSA's most important contribution to the U-2 program. There are 2 dates, if you have not already committed them to memory and have them scratched into your desktop somewhere, you should. The first is August 21st, 1957, and the second is October 4th, 1957. Basically weeks apart. August 21, 1957 is the day the Russians launched the first ICBM from Tyuratam to Kamchatka. There's some debate as to whether the missile launch was a success or not. It didn't matter. The Russians, as a movie character one put it, the damn thing went up and it worked. Whether the RV actually hit the target, well, that's something for intelligence analysts to argue about. A few weeks later, on October 4th, 1957, the Russians sent Sputnik into space. I think people of my age, I was born in 1958, the year after these momentous events took place. So, they're history to me. My father, on the other hand, remembers the sheer terror that took hold in some parts of the United States amongst the pundits, newspaper reporters, about, the Russians delighted in, Sputnik actually, emitted a little bleep, and there were people out there with little transistors trying to pick up the sound of a Russian satellite in orbit over our country. It scared a lot of people. As you can imagine, it scared the crap out of the U.S. intelligence community as well. Suddenly, the Soviet ballistic missile program became NSA's top priority, as well as the entire U.S. intelligence community's top priority, bar none. Basically, everything else took second priority. What's interesting is that NSA knew about all this 2 years earlier. A little bit of history. June 2nd, 1955, the Soviet Ministry of Defense creates 2 units. One is the Missile Test Center at Tyuratam, and the other was the impact range at Kluchi. If I mispronounce Svetlana, I apologize profusely. On the Kamchatka Peninsula. Within a matter of days after the creation of these 2 units, NSA listening posts were picking up radio chatter coming from these two newly created units. It gets reported. The CIA's current intelligence review contains some rather detailed articles speculating on what the interesting radio traffic coming out of these two previously unknown sites is all about. It turns out that NSA was quickly able to determine that the communications coming from Tyuratam and Kamchatka belonged to a special Ministry of Defense construction unit that only worked on missile projects. So over the next 2 years, NSA's monitors basically put these targets on full coverage. There's a term that NSA uses for this sort of thing, but I won't bore you with the technical details. Basically, by April 1957, which is 5 months before the first ICBM launch at Tyuratam, NSA provided a warning on April 21st, 1957, that a new enciphered communications link between Tyuratam and Kamchatka had just been activated, which in NSA's opinion meant that the missile range was about to go active. Now, if you take a look in the declassified correspondence in the CREST database up at College Park, this is when the CIA suddenly said, we've got to get a U-2 over Kamchatka. And we have to start thinking about how we get a U-2 through the previously unpenetrated southern portion of the Soviet Union to see where this missile test center is in the southern part of the country. And I can take you through the chronology. I won't bore you to tears. Needless to say, NSA gave the CIA, who in turn provided, through the current intelligence review and the Central Intelligence Bulletin, with rather detailed reporting indicating that the Soviet Ballistic Missile Center was approaching activation and the Russians appeared to be ready to launch a ballistic missile. A ICBM ballistic missile. I mean, not just any missile. So the question is, why did Eisenhower and other American politicians after Sputnik and after the ICBM launch evince so much surprise that the Russians had done this thing? Perhaps Ambassador Gardhoff knows the answer and can provide us with some fulfillment in the Q&A session. Anyway, Sputnik and the missile get launched. NSA basically, over the next year, dissects the entire the communications network supporting the Tyuratam missile system. 4 different systems get broken by the NSA cryptanalysts in basically the span of a year. Basically, every missile that gets launched, NSA knew if it was a success or failure, what its performance attributes were. I mean, it's an incredible technical accomplishment for the agency. The problem is that the one thing that NSA was not getting out of all of this technical intelligence it was collecting was where were the ICBM launch sites. I mean, they knew that the missiles were being tested. We knew what the missiles were, what their ranges were. We didn't know where the operational missiles were being put. And more importantly, we didn't know where they were being made because the SAC bomber crews needed to know both items of information if war ever came. These would be amongst the first targets. Interestingly enough, starting in March 1958, NSA starts picking up some admittedly very fragmentary SIGINT, indicating NSA figured out something. I'll dash back just a little bit. NSA figured out that there were these 2 very small little transport units based at airports outside Moscow. One was called JIP-2, which stands for the General Purpose Transport Unit. The other was the transport unit of the Soviet GCAT, the aviation and the aviation ministry, basically, or the unit, the unit that was building the Russian missiles and aircraft. They figured out that if they flight followed where these planes went by listening to their unscrambled, clear communications, they could figure out where the Russian missile plants were. Because these planes flew from Moscow to Kapustin Yar, the first Soviet missile test range, then the Tyuratam, and then they started making stops at some other places which they had never stopped at before. The first place was it's now in the Ukraine. It's a large city called Dnepropetrovsk, which was the largest Soviet missile plant. That's where it was located. And guess what? basically that served as the first indicator that we had that the Russians were building ballistic missiles at Dnepropetrovsk. The SIGINT also identified 3 other potential factories that were involved in making ballistic missiles, but more importantly, our tracking of that special military construction unit I hearkened to a little bit earlier. They started turning up in some unusual places. There was a place called Yuria, which we've already seen flashed on the screen. It was the confirmed first ICBM site. Verkhnaya Salda was another site that turned up in the SIGINT intercepts. And a little place called Plesetsk, which was, it turned out, the location of the first operational Soviet ICBM site, where the first 4 launchers, SS-6, which the Russians called R-7, were located. Now, what's interesting, if you look at the correspondence, the CIA analysts hammered NSA. That was sort of like a knee-jerk reaction. They didn't believe the intercepts. They didn't accept the NSA analysis. It was fragmentary. The NSA analysts were drawing, mountains out of a molehill. And then you see Alan Dulles and Dick Bissell rush off to the White House to try and get requests back in 1959 for additional U-2 overflights using the exact same U-2 and the NSA SIGINT that they had been bad-mouthing internally within the CIA. And it worked. I mean, the one reason why Dwight D. Eisenhower approved the 1959 overflights is because, the CIA came to him and he said, we now have some tangential, albeit very fragmentary information. We think we now know where the operational Soviet ICBM sites are located, and we think we have some indication of where they're being built. You've got to let us send in the Dragon Lady to check it out. And I've read Brigadier General John Goodpaster's memos for the record. I mean, it turns out that they always delete, the 6-letter word SIGINT out of the memos of conversation or memos for the record about what took place in the Oval Office. But it's clear because it's top secret, and then they delete out the SIGINT, the SCI code word on the memo. So what we have here is, one NSA historian described SIGINT's role in the U-2 program as basically, as the program evolved and matured, SIGINT became what he described as more and more a cue card for U-2 penetration missions. It served as a target folder filler, and it served as a justification for the planning and political justifications necessary because, as we know, Dwight D. Eisenhower loved photo interpreting, but he also loved SIGINT as well, which was a byproduct of his days as the commander in Europe during the Second World War. So you actually have an instance where, although these 2 agencies didn't like each other and didn't cooperate very well at times, for example, the 1956 Berlin Tunnel, CIA loved it, great success for the CIA. Trouble is they didn't bother to tell NSA about it until it got blown on the front page of the New York Times. Still, the agencies, they got the job done when it had to be done. So now I'd like to tell you about an issue which Chris and I have some disagreement about. Well, that's not true. Gary Powers, and it's been hearkened to by everybody who has spoken here, there's some difference of opinion. It first appeared, I think, in Mike Beschloss's book in 1986. Gary Powers said that he was shot down while flying at 70,000 feet near the city of Sverdlovsk. Turns out NSA had intercepts of Soviet air defense tracking communications, probably from the same battalion that Major Voronov was part of, but it doesn't really matter. I've asked NSA to declassify a rather lengthy report that they prepared on the subject. What's clear is that NSA came back with a report that said, in essence, I'll read you what's contained in the NSA. This is the 3-volume, or now it's a 4-volume NSA history. NSA's radar, radio interceptors tracked Powers aircraft descending from 65,000 feet to somewhere between 30 and 40,000 feet, changed course back towards Sverdlovsk and then disappear completely off the Soviet radar screen 35 minutes later. That's a quote from the NSA official history. The problem is, I mean, I'm sure that Francis Gary Powers' version of events is absolutely correct. He probably was, in fact, shot down at 70,000 feet. We all know that radar operators, even in our glorious FAA system, make mistakes. Get figures wrong in the heat of the moment. The problem is that these figures ended up in a top-secret code word NSA report that went to CI Director Dulles. Right. I've been told to speed up delivery, so I shall. But it took 2 years between the time that Gary Powers was shot down in May 1960 and the time that he came across the Gleinicke Bridge. Judge Prettyman holds a hearing, or a panel hearing, to investigate all aspects of the shoot-down. The most contentious aspect, and the one part of the Prettyman transcript, transcripts that has never been declassified and released so far, is the grilling of Henry Fenwick, who was the NSA air defense expert, who it's his name on the report that said that Gary Powers was actually descending, perhaps to use the term trying to defect, which nobody believes, but he took grave exception to the official CIA version, which said that Powers was shot down at 70,000 feet. A battle royal ensues in the hearing room at CIA headquarters where Judge Prettyman was sitting. Every senior official that the NSA could muster to sit in the room arrives in full dress uniform, and a CIA official named John Bross, who was a trial lawyer before he was a CIA official, is brought in to literally rake over the coals poor Henry Fenwick, the NSA air defense expert. Over a span of 3 days of cross-examination, Bross basically reduced Fenwick. I think probably after 3 days of cross-examination, you admit that your name was Boris Suvorov and that your nationality was anything but American. But basically, after 3 days of cross-examination, Bross said, your witness, walked away, and basically with the NSA version of events, in tatters. As you can imagine, the NSA director and deputy director took the gravest possible exception to their official being treated as like a criminal witness on the stand. But there's an interesting letter from Dr. Lou Tordella, who was the NSA deputy director at the time, who wrote this wonderful little phrase in a letter, and he said, he wrote the letter to the NSA General Counsel saying that he said that much of the questioning that the board had enacted on the NSA official was harsh, but Tordella admitted in the letter, and he said he considered the board arrived at the best decision, in the sense that the interests of the United States and its intelligence community were least jeopardized, which I interpret to mean protecting the reputation of the CIA and the rest of the intelligence community was, in his opinion, the politic thing to do. Now, Lou Tordella unfortunately passed away before I interviewed Tordella, but I did not know that he had written those words at the time that I spoke to him. So, I conclude, and that's it. Thank you.
Well done. All right, thank you, Matthew. Covered the territory extremely ably. Tim, I first of all got a question for you. Do we have to finish at 5:30 on the dot?
We do more or less.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess we'll take some questions, and as they say, perhaps we can finish the discussion in the bar somewhere afterwards. I just want to jump in first and try and get Matt. I don't think we disagree at all about the Powers shoot down, but I would like to try and get Matthew to rail back a bit from the statement that each and every U-2 overflight the NSA was listening in, because as I explained earlier, I can find no indication that the July 59 mission was tagged at all by the Soviets. The next two missions, which were flown by the Brit pilots, I have some information that, which is not in any of the declassified documents, that those two flights were identified on exit only. It so happens that they weren't going down to Iran like the July 59 mission. They were recovering directly into Turkey, so they actually exited over a stronger Soviet EW radar area. And then we come to the 9th of April mission, and that was certainly and unequivocally detected. So that's my only comment there.
The only thing I can tell you is that the National Security Agency history disagree with you on the July 9/59. Tom Johnson's history says that Soviet radar tracking of the U-2 overflight on July 9th, the mission had been continuous and very accurate, and a Soviet fighter had chased the American reconnaissance aircraft all the way to the border before turning back and returning to base.
Well, I think that NSA history is wrong, and that's talking about the 9th of April 1960 flight. Okay.
Tom Johnson should be here.
He should be here. We asked him to come. Anyway, as before, microphone, please, before you speak. And let's see who's in my eyesight. I can see 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's start over here.
Yeah, hi, Bob Cook. Over the years, every now and then, a recipient of some of the product from U-2. Just two quick things. The first was the comment about the response in the Soviet Union to U-2. But the one thing I haven't heard mentioned was, I always thought was the main point that's with us here today, and it's not the fact that it's 50 years ago, that's bad enough, but it's the fact that Dwight David Eisenhower, for the first time, and I was 16, I was 16 years old, very impressionable, for the first time he got on television and lied. The presidents had been wrong, or they wouldn't say anything. Dwight Eisenhower was like that. But he lied, and I think from that moment on, I liked Ike. I had one of those little buttons you used to flip from a picture. I like Ike. Little kid, didn't know anything, but I liked Ike. And then I never believed the president again. One other quick thing about the Sputnik, which I do remember, I was 13, and I hear this often about panic and terror, the response of the American people. And you were only one year old at the time?
I wasn't even born.
I remember that. I remember like it was yesterday. I also remember getting Life magazine with the Mighty Red Missile single-page article.
Do you still have it?
I still have the page.
It's worth a fortune.
Is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Congratulations.
I'll check eBay. No, but I found that disquieting. But then just 2 months later, and I won't belabor this, but Walter Cronkite, who I seem to remember was on at 11 p.m., was sitting there. The Soviet Union today launched the world's first artificial satellite. And of course, we'd been following Vanguard, the development of that. So I went in, Mommy, Dad, Mom. Don't worry about it, kid. Rolled over. And there was no panic. And in the subsequent weeks, we used to go out in the backyard, and then Sputnik 2, a month later, which was far more visible. We'd be looking up, and you felt, what's that, about 2.5, 3 inches? Worse than terror. The Soviet Union had humiliated us. So humiliation was really the thing, at least in the New York area. So I don't know about where you're from.
I'm a New Yorker too, so.
I'm going to, in the interests of using our time efficiently, I'm going to
Sorry
take
about
another
that,
couple of
Laura.
questions, and that I take as a comment useful rather than directly requiring an answer from the panelists. Let's go on to some questions. The next guy along there.
There was this delay. The Soviets had the evidence which they could have shown the Americans quietly, which would have might have led to a different outcome. So the one missing piece is, why did they not quietly, sotto voce, indicate to the Americans, look, we've caught you, to use a phrase, red-handed in this overflight. This might have mitigated Eisenhower's problem.
Okay, I'll take one more. Over there.
Thank you. Just a brief comment.
Sergei Chetverikov of Hogan and Hartson. I think Svetlana presented a rather rosy picture of Mr. Khrushchev. He sure was a pleasant person and great fun to work for. I worked for him as an interpreter at my previous incarnation as a senior foreign service officer in the Soviet Union. But he was certainly quite unpredictable. And in this situation, after the shoot down of U-2, he wanted a major propaganda show. Of course, he wanted to make an announcement, a spectacular announcement that Powers was captured. But that was unfortunately ruined by, as we know, by Chet, a senior Soviet diplomat at Kremlin reception to the U.S. ambassador at that time. So still, Khrushchev, of course, is remembered very well among the Russian people, first for affordable housing after the war devastation, and also for corn growing. And I must tell you that it was not entirely a failure. Corn grows well near my country house. Still. So, and clearly he made a major contribution to the disarmament effort and concept. And also his famous phrase, "will bury you," did not have any physical meaning, but it should have been interpreted, even though it is not always the case, in the concept, in the terms of competition between two socio-economic systems, between capitalism and socialism, not communism, gentlemen, because we never reached that stage, unfortunately. Thank you very much.
All right. Does Svetlana have any comment or
To the question, why not quietly present Eisenhower with evidence? And here I don't see much of a disagreement with Sergei Chetverikov. I think that the whole idea, yes, in addition to the propaganda element, was to wait and see Americans make up a cover story, and then to publicly guilt them, to publicly shame them in order to make them more flexible on arms control. So it's not contradictory, and I think it's not so much a rosy picture. It does show him as erratic and unpredictable, but holding some strong views that at the time were very optimistic and hopeful.
I see that you like and doing that.
There was on that. There was one point between the shoot down and the summit when, according to Taubman, I think Khrushchev took Llewellyn on one side and said, "You got to help me. You know, something. Throw me a
Right before he leaves for the summit.
throw me a bone. You know." And if that account is accurate, then it indicates that he was willing to pursue something other than a major propaganda victory in Paris.
Okay.
It sounded pretty good to me.
I've got one quick question for Giles, and then I'm going to do a last scan to see if we've got any other questions out there. And my question is your conversation with the Batustin, the junior officer with Voronev in that SA-2 battalion, because if he went outside and unequivocally saw the aeroplane, what he understood to be the U-2 being shot down, why didn't he go inside and tell Voronev? Because Voronev did not report a positive shoot down for 30 minutes, and that's what led to the further confusion in the Soviet air defense forces and led to the shooting down of the MiG.
I'm not sure that he didn't go back inside. He was with a bunch of his fellow officers and say what he saw. But, as you say, the fact remains that Voronov decided to wait. He was unsure of what he'd seen on his radar screen.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to get out. Have we got any more questions anywhere? Ambassador Gartov? The mic?
1-minute comments. First, I just wanted to say that in the period when when I was writing these estimates, we gave very great attention to the NSA located sites. They were the critical thing, and not just when Mr. Dulles mentioned this, but throughout the work in general, and critically important and recognized as such. The second is with respect to the peripheral flights and their possible connection one way or another with the U-2 program. In addition to any decoy flights, of course, there were actual comment peripheral flights, for example, one of which had been shot down just in 1958. I don't know whether it accidentally strayed into Soviet territory or whether they fired over the line, but in any case, it was not intended to be an overflight, but it was in dangerous territory and was shot down into Armenia. By the way, the time of the American National Exhibition in Moscow in the summer of '59, some of the young Russians spoke to our guides at the thing about, in a jocular way, not in a challenging way, that you ought to come and see the other American exhibition too. The Soviets had put the remnants of this C-130 or whatever it was from 1958 Armenia on exhibition at another park, while ours was at Sokolniki.
Well, at least you got an invitation. That's very nice.
All right. Well, if there are no further questions, I'm going to wrap this up with a thank you to our three panelists. I think we've had an interesting afternoon. I think we've covered the ground. And thanks again to the CWIHP for putting this on. And thank you all for coming.